My job on behalf of the coalition is to give you our reaction in terms of what it means for Ireland, economically, socially and politically, and what we need to do about it. For us, I guess, for me, the most striking aspect of this report is that scientists are now as certain that climate change is happening and that humanity is causing it as they are that smoking causes cancer. That new level of confidence that they've expressed in this report, that 95% certainty, which is only up from 90 in 2007 and 66 in 2001. It might seem like a small jump from 90 to 95, but in scientific terms, it is another level of confidence on their part. And it is comparable, not in every detail, but comparable to the way that the science, the medical science around the impact of tobacco moved over the course of decades. And why I think that's significant, I think it's significant for two reasons. One is, it's understandable. People get it. People in the wider public, not those of you who came here today, who already have a feeling for climate change, they have a sense of both the impact that smoking has and the way it's been handled as a public policy issue over the years, and how over time governments have got more and more keen to discourage people from smoking. Crucially for us, I think that what's striking about that analogy is that long after this level of certainty was established in the medical field, there were still those who tried to undermine the science, who tried to put off action, who, even if you think of our smoking ban in pubs, whatever it is, 10 years ago now, even at that point in the early 2000s, there were still those who wanted to resist action to curb smoking. And governments eventually, for a long time, they succumbed to that pressure, but over time they realized the science was robust, the science was strong, and that the public health issue had to override the private interest issue of the corporations who were behind that effort to resist efforts to regulate and curb tobacco. And the same is true in climate change. You just insert fossil fuel companies in particular for tobacco companies, and you get the same dynamic. And indeed, if you want to read more about it, there's a book called Merchants of Doubt. You'll see that those companies have used the same techniques, the same PR companies indeed, and some of the same scientists to try and undermine the science of climate change. It hasn't worked, despite some wobbles in public opinion. The majorities, including in the US, remain of the view that they accept the science, and we hope this report will, in a sense, end the debate about whether humanity is causing climate change and allow us to move on to the issue of action, because, as John has described, our window for action is closing. Obviously, every degree counts, every bit we contain climate change counts, but the governments of the world have agreed that 2 degrees centigrade is the threshold for not too dangerous climate change. We want to contain climate change to less than 2 degrees. Now, not everyone agrees with that. That is a political decision more than it can't be inferred purely from the science. And in fact, many developing countries in the southern hemisphere think 2 degrees is too high, and Friends of the Earth International would agree. We will see plenty of climate change at 2 degrees of global warming, and it would be quite disruptive, particularly for, say, the small island states in the South Pacific, who even at that level would have to evacuate their islands and see them go underground or go underwater. So many of us would say, and this was a big debate inside the UN process around the politics as opposed to the science, that 1.5 degrees of global warming is in fact the safe limit, or the safer limit. Nothing is safe. Any degree of climate change is unpredictable. And the reason to mention all that today is because if you look at the latest science we're now seeing authoritatively summarized today, there are 4 scenarios they paint for how emissions might go and how temperatures might go over the coming century. And only in one of those 4 scenarios, the scenario of maximum action, do we stay within a safe limit? Do we see only 1.5 degrees of warming above from pre-industrial levels in the course of this century? And only in that scenario does it begin to stop after that. In all other scenarios, we're more likely than not, or very likely, to exceed 2 degrees, the safe warming level, and the warming will continue into the next century. So, in a sense, we only have a 1 in 4 shot right now of staying within safe limits, and that depends fully on maximum action right now and sustained action by governments around the world to cut our emissions and cut our use of fossil fuels. So this is really, I think, the final wake-up call for governments. I think the way I've described it today so far is that the 2007 report from the IPCC was a wake-up call for governments, but 2 years later in Copenhagen, when they failed to agree a deal, they essentially pressed the snooze button on that wake-up call. The alarm has sounded again today, louder and clearer than ever before from the IPCC, and crucially, as John described, governments have signed off on this report. This is not just environmentalists at all, or even just scientists in an ivory tower describing reality. the summary that's released today is the overarching summary for policymakers, signed off by all the members of the IPCC. 195 governments are subscribed to the IPCC. So therefore, I used to be able to say about the last report that the science that I campaign on was signed off by the Bush administration. Well, this one is signed off by the Abbott administration in Australia, by the Saudi Arabians, by Russia, by Canada. So they have no excuse for not acting on the science that they themselves have accepted. And of course, it's not just about the environment, it's about our economy. If we look at Ireland, both the Irish and the international economy, the estimates from the Stern report a few years ago is that if we don't contain climate change to relatively safe levels, we could see between 5 and 20% of global GDP wiped out by the middle of this century. Now, we know in Ireland we are a small, open economy dependent, they never tire telling us we're a small, open economy dependent on global trade and on the global economy for our prosperity and on our jobs. That level of GDP loss by the middle of this century, which would come from uncontained climate change, would be catastrophic for the global economy, would be massively disruptive. And even if Ireland didn't see our climate change to the extent that we couldn't operate, the changes in the global economy would devastate the Irish economy. And indeed, from a humanitarian perspective, we would see massive movements of people from places like Bangladesh, from places in parts of Africa where sustainable livelihoods would not be locally available. So the upheaval across the world would be both a humanitarian disaster and, in purely selfish national interest terms, an economic disaster for Ireland. And it's for those reasons, as well as for the reasons of justice, the reasons of the precautionary principle, the reasons of common sense, that our governments must act, while doing so in the face of powerful vested interests who see short-term losses from the adjustment. Because as always in these things, the people who see the short-term cost of adjustment are well-informed, well-concentrated and well-organised, whereas in the case of climate change, those who are most effective are dispersed, they're consumers, they're taxpayers, they're not so well-informed, and in some cases with climate change they're not yet born, although in fact we mustn't stray too far into our children's children here. We're talking about children born today who will bear the brunt of climate change this century. So, we need to see action now. What does the coalition think that means? Well, principally it means that the primary focus right now in our call for action is around the government's proposed climate change law, long in the works and now at draft stage in the Oireachtas. The climate change, the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition described the bill that was published, the draft bill in February, as too weak to work. It has no 2050 target. A 2050 target, a climate bill without a 2050 target is like a car without an engine. It might look nice, it might be window dressing, but it won't get you where you want to go. And we need to see a strong 2050 target in line with the science published today in the final bill published by the government before the end of this year. The second major flaw in the bill that was published was that the independent committee, as it's called, it wasn't independent enough. It couldn't even publish its own reports. It relied on the grace and favour of the government, to whom it would give its reports in private, and only if and when the government wanted would they be published. So the good news is that those committee hearings that the Oireachtas had in the summer were good. They're constructive, serious. I heard from a range of stakeholders. The TDs and senators who were there really paid attention. They're now drafting their report. We hope and expect that if it reflects the evidence that they heard, it will call for a much stronger bill. And we then have to hope, and indeed more than hope, campaign and press that the Irish government respects that process and implements the changes. They made a big fuss about this. This is the new way of doing legislation. It's the way they did the X legislation earlier, the children's bill legislation, and it's the way that Enda Kenny says they will do legislation instead of having a seanad. He is saying this is part of our political reform. So it will behove them to respect the outcomes of that process when they're published in the next few weeks if they're serious about political reform. The other aspect of this is aid and solidarity with those in the rest of the world who will suffer even more and even sooner than we will in Ireland. It's well known, obviously, that the people who have done least to cause climate change are suffering most already, and many of the members of the coalition, like Oxfam, Trócaire, Christian Aid, Concern, I shouldn't have started that, all the development agencies who are part of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition work on the front line with people in the developing world who are facing climate change right now. And Ireland has promised, along with the other rich countries in the world, to, in solidarity for the damages that we have caused, in compensation for what we have caused, to provide climate finance for mitigation efforts in those countries, and specifically for adaptation, so they can cope with the climate change that they didn't cause. Now, as ever, the world governments are falling behind in their promises. So we need to see action from Ireland as to how it's going to provide that finance. And it mustn't come from already existing overseas aid. That's needed for schools and hospitals and clean water. It must come from new and additional resources. And we're clear that the best way to do that is to create a separate climate fund, a bit like the environment fund that already exists. And the proceeds from the carbon tax, the proceeds from selling the permits under the European Trading Scheme could go in there and could then be used to meet Ireland's obligations for new and additional climate finance. And we want to see the Minister for the Environment, who will go on behalf of Ireland to the UN climate talks in November in Warsaw, announce there the establishment of a climate fund that would serve that purpose. It will then need to be included in the climate bill, obviously, to be established formally in statute, but he can make the announcement right now. And so they're the two big things we want to see action on from the Irish government, to show that it takes this science seriously and it takes its role in being a progressive government looking for a global deal seriously. Because we have 2 years now to the next big climate summit in Paris, where this science should be taken seriously by governments and, if you want, turned into a programme for action. One thing I think it's worth pointing out, as you know, our former President Mary Robinson has become increasingly involved in climate change over the last few years in an effort to improve the process of the talks, to improve the involvement of women from around the world, and to improve the involvement of the people and representatives from developing countries. Really interestingly, though, in the last week, she's come out and said that if we are going to solve climate change, we're going to have to leave much of the fossil fuel reserves in the world in the ground. Now, that's a really radical statement that until now you only heard more radical groups make. But to hear a former President of Ireland say that we need to leave the oil, leave the shale gas, leave the coal in the ground is really significant. And indeed the calculations around that would suggest that we need to probably leave up to 80%, but certainly as much as half of currently known fossil fuel resources in the ground. And that really gives you an idea of the opposition we'll be up against, and the reason, in the same way that the tobacco companies did fight the science around tobacco, the fossil fuel companies will fight the science around climate change. We mustn't be taken in by that. We mustn't let our politicians be taken in by that, just because those organisations are very organised and very powerful and very rich and can buy the media. Events like today by the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition and the actions we take together as a coalition over the next six months and 2 years will be to make sure that the citizens' voices are heard in Ireland, citizens of Ireland itself and those that we are in solidarity with in the global south, to make sure that our government acts in the long-term public interest and the interest of climate justice and not in short-term private interest of private corporations. Thanks very much.